start with some introductory remarks and then we'll get started with this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is, excuse me, it's a bad look. My name is Mike Bullis. I'm executive director of the Image Center of Maryland. We're the CIL that serves Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Harford County. We have several other Center for Independent Living directors here today. I am is pleased to bring you this program, Independence Amplified Maryland, issues of importance to people with disabilities, and in this instance, it's providers and people with disabilities throughout the nation have an interest in what happens with legislation. So we've asked four of the really activist organizations in the country that are involved in legislation to come and speak with us today. This program is being recorded and you have been muted. If you want to speak, you have a couple of options, actually three options. You could raise your hand. You can put something in the chat. Now we got music. Does anybody know what? Oh, okay. Um, you can raise your hand if you want to and be recognized that way, or you can unmute yourself. However, we will be watching because if there's background noise, we want to keep that to a minimum. So thank you all very much for being here. There will be community announcements at the end of the program for today. So if your organization has something going on that you want people to know about, please feel free to tell us about it at the end of the program around 1:50 or 1:55 when we finished. And let me mention next week's IM program just for a moment here. Work without fear, using work incentives to protect benefits when you work. It's a very critical situation for lots of folks. So next week will be an hour-long discussion of benefits, how to access benefits planning, how to protect your income when you work. Advocacy, education, and action are the keys to success for all communities, but in this instance, specifically for folks with disabilities. There's not a single issue we have advocated for over the years that we haven't made progress on. It depends on individuals like you and me to mail letters to. There's somebody who's got some music going again. To send emails, to send to speak to Congress when necessary, to call your congressperson. All of these things are what make success. Yes, these national organizations do provide leadership, but they need you and I to take action and do things. So we have the United Spinal Association here today. We have the National Federation of the Blind. We have ADAPT, and we have the National Council on Independent Living. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with this group today. For the first summary of national legislative activities, welcome to Steve Lieberman from the United Spinal Association. Steve, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Lieberman. I'm a Director of Policy and Advocacy for the United Spinal Association. This has been a bit of a strange year. We at United Spinal had to mobilize pretty quickly when the COVID pandemic really took hold, and that certainly shifted our policy priorities for the year. Among the priorities that we really had to mobilize on quickly was providing personal protective equipment for people with disabilities and their caregivers, something that in the immediate stages of the COVID pandemic, there was a very real need for. And so we set out to distribute face masks to our members, which was a real all hands on deck effort. But among the other things that we really wanted to focus on as COVID hit, this provided all of us, I think, a really great opportunity to show just how radically we need to shift people out of nursing homes and other institutional settings and back into the community. And so we've very much been focused on a radical shift of funding towards Medicaid home and community-based services, which we saw the House of Representatives pass in the HEROES Act several months ago, but which the Senate has not taken action on. Additional items that we've been focused on: expanding paid leave to cover family caregiving of adults with disabilities. We saw in the early stages of COVID, the Congress passed legislation to expand paid leave programs, but did so in very limited circumstances. And so certain folks were left out, and we certainly want to see, like the HEROES Act included, an expansion of those paid leave programs. Additionally, we're looking for additional pay for whether you call them PCAs or DSPs, accessible COVID testing for people with disabilities. One thing that we heard a lot from our members around the country was they would try and go to get tested for COVID, and the testing site wouldn't be accessible. They would have inaccessible protocols. They'd say, oh, well, you have to get out of the vehicle. Well, if you're a wheelchair user and you're in a modified vehicle and you're in the middle of the vehicle, they're not letting you, they're not coming into the vehicle to do the tests. They're saying you have to get out of the vehicle. That's something that we fought back on, especially in New York. We're very much focused on voting. The way we vote in this country is something that's really shifting very quickly in light of the pandemic. We see that polls are showing that more than half of voters are going to be voting by mail or early voting, which is something that we haven't seen in this country before. So making sure that everybody is able to cast a private and independent ballot is something that we're very much focused on. Additional priorities that we have, regardless of whether the COVID pandemic is going on or not, we're obviously very focused on independent living, deinstitutionalization, employment, transportation equity. United Spinal has for many years been a leader in the area of transportation. That's where we really made our name. Jim Weissman, our president and CEO, was a key leader in drafting the transportation portions of the ADA. So it's something that we very much focus on. We worked with Congressman Jim Langevin's office last year through, and was finally introduced in March, the Disability Access to Transportation Act, which is a bill that would expand several provisions in federal law related to transportation, including a pilot program that would include a one-stop paratransit program, upgrading the ability to submit accessibility complaints into really the 20th century. At this point, there's not an online complaint form that you can fill out. It's something that, it's a PDF and you have to print it out and mail it in. It's not accessible. Finally, we'd have some way to submit that online, and an accessibility data program that we can collect data from around the country to show just how accessible is our transportation system and where do we need to make improvements. We're obviously very much focused on disability rights, preserving the ADA and the Rehab Act. We saw last week there was an attempt to really roll back the ADA in the Senate COVID bill that was voted down. So we're glad to see that voted down. We focus on a lot of other things, Medicare, CRT, SSI and SSDI, improving those, getting rid of the marriage penalty, upgrading, getting the asset limits finally raised beyond what they were decades ago. where right now we're focused on ending the subminimum wage as well. Frankly, it's amazing that we're in 2020 and we still are paying some people less than everyone else. That needs to change. We're trying to get enhanced funding for SCI model systems. There are 14 SCI model systems around the country that provide premier care for people with spinal cord injury. Funding for those programs haven't been increased really much in the last 20 years, even though the spinal cord injured population has increased by 50% in that time. So we're looking to expand the funding for that program, as well as increase the number of SCI model systems that are funded in one funding cycle. 20 years ago, there were 18 model systems funded. It's been 14 for about the last decade, and we want to see that number go back up to 18. So, we're doing a lot. There's obviously a lot of work to be done. We have our own advocacy program that we call the Grassroots Advocacy Network. We'd love to see more people join, especially from Maryland. And I'm just going to slip the link, sign up for that in the chat. And I'll turn it back over to you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Just for my own information, what is CRT Medicare?
Medicare CRT, so complex rehab technology. Folks that are wheelchair users, they're not going to just get a wheelchair off the rack. They're going to, get their own customized wheelchair. And so, we've had an issue where, there's currently a discrepancy in pricing between complex manual wheelchairs versus complex power wheelchairs. One is currently or would be subject to competitive bidding under Medicare come January, whereas one wouldn't. And actually, several years ago, this seemingly was prohibited by law, and yet CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, decided they wanted to move ahead with this anyway. I think it was just last year that Congress passed legislation to take power wheelchairs out of the competitive bidding program, but as of this moment, complex manual wheelchairs still are seemingly would be subject to it come January. And so we were, over the summer, we were lobbying House offices to sign a letter saying, to CMS saying, let's not do this. And I think we managed to get a very large number of House offices to sign on to that letter.
Good. Well, thank you very much. That's an excellent summary of lots of things. I'm sure that that will. You've covered a lot of things that other presenters are going to cover. So let's see where we go from here. Moving next to John Perret, a colleague of mine that I've worked with for many years, from the National Federation of the Blind, one of the strongest advocacy organizations for folks with disabilities in the world. And John Perret, we're pleased to have you here for your remarks.
All right, Mike, thank you so much, and thanks for organizing this meeting. Thanks to the other panelists and the fine work that being done at United Spinal, Nickel, and ADAPT. I've worked very closely with all three groups. National Federation of Blind works very closely with all three groups, and all the people have tuned in from all over the state to do this. And the fact that you've been doing this, I know, week after week, as COVID-19 took hold, I think it's a really great way to keep people in the state educated. So thank you for that very much. As far as some of the things, I think all four speakers are going to say we're working on voting. I think everyone's going to be happy to hear that. And certainly the National Federation of Blind, the National Federation of Blind of Maryland, absolutely working on voting. So I would say that's our number one issue, combined with the timing of the upcoming presidential election, combined with COVID-19. The Help America Vote Act, when it was passed about 10 years ago, says that every polling place in America must have at least one machine that is non-visually accessible for voting, that allows you to vote privately and independently as a blind person, and guaranteeing other accessibility. That, when that happened, that was really a breakthrough, because that's as we were moving from paper ballots to electronic ballots, all in person, but moving to that, and that was just such a breakthrough. Now what's happened is a variety of things have happened in terms of moving to paper and trying to protect the right of blind people to still, and other people with disabilities, to vote privately and independently, but in person. That was over the last, say, 3 or 4 years. And then suddenly now here with COVID-19, we have to really focus on not just in person, but this huge move to vote by mail. And I'll just use vote by mail to be equivalent to absentee or vote from home or whatever the different terminology that different states have. I think here in Maryland now, we've really moved to vote by mail terminology. So luckily here in Maryland, and actually the NFB, and I think the other groups on the call, in many cases are working across the country to make sure in the vote by mail situation that you're able to vote privately and independently from home. A lot of times this means that you have to have equipment. In terms of a blind person, you'd have to have a computer with screen reading software and a printer that allow you to access a website. That certainly works well here in Maryland. I voted using the vote from home, vote by mail software myself in the primary that we just recently had. So that's working well. It's important to remember that not everyone will have the equipment, or they might have the desire to vote from home, to vote by mail. They won't necessarily have the equipment. So people should still have an option to go in person. So we're working very hard to make sure that people have the option to vote by mail, privately, independently, typically using their own equipment, or to vote in person, early voting or day of voting in person, and to make sure that there's enough sites. In the election with Congressman Mafumé, in his primary that occurred, this is the special election. I guess it wasn't the primary, it was the actual election, his special election. And in that case, there was one voting place per county. His district stretches across 3 counties. That really wasn't enough. That creates then a huge transportation problem for people with disabilities to try to get to the polling place in the event they need to vote in person, because they don't have the ability to vote by mail. So all these different aspects need to be combined. Really, our theme would be to make sure that people with disabilities have the same opportunity, the same ease of voting, same opportunity to vote, the same privacy, the same secrecy to vote as everyone else does. I think that's core to our democracy, and we need to work very hard to protect that. As they said at United Spinal, we're also working very hard to continue to protect competitive and integrated employment. So there's various things that have been popping up related to that. So we work very hard to continue to protect that. Our national convention, which was virtual, was just the end of mid-July. We did pass 28 resolutions. A lot of those resolutions I think might be of interest to this group. You can find them at nfb.org/resolutions. So that was www.nfb, for National Federation of the Blind, .org/ and the word resolutions, plural. And there's a couple related to voting. There is one that's interesting. I would like to bring to people's attention. There was a sheltered workshop in Louisiana that Louisiana Center for the Blind, no, it's Louisiana Agency for the Blind, I think. And it's spelled out in one of the resolutions. And it uses a very obscure loophole in Louisiana law which allows them to not pay unemployment insurance for the people who work there. Now what's happened is with COVID-19, and really before that, some people after working there for a while lost their job, went to apply for unemployment insurance only to find that the unemployment insurance wasn't being paid and they weren't entitled to unemployment insurance. And this is terrible. And you know, when you trust the employer who claims to say that we treat you like an employee, like other people get treated like employees, but then find that that's not really true, that they haven't been classifying you as an employee, they've been classifying you in some other way that avoids the unemployment insurance, that's something that we really need to bring to people's attention. So that's an effort we're working on right now to try to figure out how widespread this might be across the United States, and whether it might even include situations where people aren't being paid, aren't having the proper FICA insurance, your Social Security insurance withhold, in situations where people are at least under the impression that they're classified as an employee. This coming Thursday, the United States Commission for Civil Rights will be releasing their report. I don't know exactly what time, sometime this Thursday, on subminimum wage and the 14C exception, which allows employers to pay people with disabilities less than the minimum wage. We're hoping that it really supports, I think, everyone in this call's position that exemption should not be allowed, that it should be repealed, and that everyone, that people with disabilities should be able to get the same opportunity to wages that other people get. So I urge you to watch for that. If the report's good, to promote it. And so we'll be closely watching for that. That's this coming Thursday. They've been working on this report for over a year, had done tours. They had a day of hearings in DC. This was back before COVID-19. There's probably several people on this call that maybe actually testified. I testified during the 2-minute slots that they allowed for the public, and it was really, really quite a good day. The last thing then to mention is related to that is the Transformation of the Competitive Employment Act, sponsored by Bobby Scott in the House and Senator Casey in the Senate. We certainly hope that we can get that bill passed. You know, we have a leadership position here in Maryland because we actually already have a law that's phasing out Section 14C, but the rest of the country needs to have the same benefit. There's a few states like us, really, Vermont, New Hampshire, Alaska, and Maine. They're not all laws. Some of them, like Vermont, they simply just don't have any subminimum wage, but the rest of the country does. And I think we can help lead by example and lead by helping to get these bills passed to help all people with disabilities in America not be exploited through the 14C exemption. That would be my quick overview there, Mike.
Oops. Excellent. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, and gives us a lot to chew over. I'm sure people have questions. Hold on to your questions until we get all the speakers done here, and then we will, my phone started ringing. Sorry about that. Hold all your questions, and when we're through with the next two speakers, we will have plenty of opportunity for questions. Next, we have with us Amy Heighton with National ADAPT. ADAPT is a longtime leader in advocacy for folks with significant disabilities. Amy Heighton, welcome to the program, and thank you for being here today.
Hey there. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we appreciate it. My name is Amy Heighton. I'm actually located in Kansas, and I'm a local organizer and an organizer with National ADAPT. And so I think those of you who are familiar with ADAPT, I'm going to try not to step too much all over kind of what Lindsay's going to say, although there's often a convergence on the things that we work on. But for many, many years, about 30 or more, ADAPT has been focused on the issue, very sort of almost, laser focused on the issue of ending the institutional bias. And by that, we mean that the long-term services and supports system in our country has been built on a foundation of well-funded and entrenched systems that that really tend to favor placing people in congregate and institutional facilities over building out the services and supports and investing in our communities in ways that make meaningful choice an option for people with disabilities to live in the community. And so it probably will come as no surprise that when we're looking at sort of the legislative and public policy agenda, that we know that for years and years, and I saw Audrey and I see Crosby out there, for years and years, ADAPT has really, our stock in trade has been that nursing homes equal death, that institutions are the places where we send people to forget about them or to leave them to die. And I think that we all can see pretty clearly that that is exactly the case. That is exactly what is happening in the current situation. People in institutional settings are dying at a highly, highly disproportionate rate as compared to the rest of the population. And there are good reasons to believe, there's a lot of information coming out of, for example, the state of Virginia and a variety of other locations in the country that are actually would support that it's not that it is actually certain populations of disabled people. So people with intellectual and developmental disabilities appear to be particularly at risk with respect to the fact that they are congregated into group home types of settings, group employment types of settings. I mean, this really does sort of dovetail into what John was talking about with respect to the sub-minimum wage and the conditions under which people are congregated into those types of work settings where they're paid less money and exposed to greater risk and danger. And similarly, along with there being good reason to believe that specific folks with specific types of disabilities are at greater risk, the thing that we know and the thing that we're seeing play out in real time in front of us is that people from marginalized, racially, particularly racially marginalized women, Black, Indigenous, and women of color, are at greater risk because of the work that they provide, the work that they do in these institutional settings. And there is good reason to believe that people who are in facilities, even when we're talking about nursing facilities, where there is a higher population percentage of marginalized, racially marginalized people, the death statistics and the death rates in those facilities are greater yet. And so the call that so for many years, it felt for ADAPT hyperbolic, right? It felt like we were being dramatic, which we're actually fine with that, but it felt like we were being dramatic when we would say that, you know, I'd rather go to jail than die in a nursing home. Unfortunately, it appears as though there are a certain number of people who are willing to let either both or definitely one of those things happen. So our, for ADAPT's perspective, our legislative priorities really do remain the same, and they're very consistent with a lot of the stuff that you've heard already. First and foremost, we need to see a permanent reauthorization of the federal Money Follows the Person program. So there are a couple of options with that. There's a House Bill HR 1342 and S548, which are in the current Congress, that would offer a longer term authorization of Money Follows the Person. Up till now, that reauthorization has been happening on a piecemeal basis as part of like continuing budget resolutions, funding extensions. But the reality is that what we really need what we've seen, and there's studies that indicate that this is true, is that as the full and permanent program has lagged in terms of an actual reauthorization, we have seen the effectiveness of this program that up till now has been highly effective. That effectiveness has been reduced as states have had to live under the uncertainty of whether the program is going to continue or not. And then the formal requirements of the program with respect to both reporting and with respect to closing beds behind people so that the money actually does follow individuals as they leave institutional settings and go into the community, and it infuses those resources back to the community. As those requirements have just sort of been in limbo, we've seen the program itself become less effective. I think folks know that really anything else, yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Anything else that can be done to end the institutional bias. For several years, ADAPT has worked on a piece of legislation called the Disability Integration Act, which has been a bill that is intended to create a framework for states to evaluate the resources that will be needed to make communities better equipped for a reality, to make community living a reality. And then a second part of that bill is the basically putting into statutory language the Supreme Court's decision in the Olmstead case. The idea that people, that the right to live in community is in fact enshrined as one of our civil rights. And so I think Steve mentioned earlier the HEROES Act. When we're looking at ending the institutional bias, finding ways to use the HEROES Act to provide resources to home and community-based services. Folks need to take note. Millions of dollars have been given to the nursing home industry. Millions of dollars through CARES funds have been given to providers. But we have yet to see any money dedicated to home and community-based services for folks. And that is absolutely the most stark way that you can see how the institutional bias works. Money automatically flows to facilities. The exception is that we have to fight tooth and nail to get those kinds of resources so individuals can have access to protective equipment, so that our workers can get hazard and overtime pay, and we can get access to emergency services, rental assistance, and housing. So we need to see those things as well. Probably I'm gonna, and I'll just sort of touch on these. The Ready for Disasters Act bill, which is Senate Bill 1755, and the DERMA bill, which is a Medicaid, Disaster Readiness Medicaid Act, I believe, which is HR 3215, and Senate Bill 1754. Those bills would go a long way towards balancing the institutional bias toward community, and in particular in times of disaster, and much like we find ourselves in now, much like everybody in Louisiana and on the coast of Texas and in Oregon and Washington and California and soon Florida again find themselves in. This is the problem, is that the institutional bias, as long as it exists, every time disaster strikes the disability community, we get caught short. And we have to create parity. We have to create systems that are meaningful community choices and options and services for folks. I don't want to take up too awful much time, but I can tell you that from ADAPT's perspective, there are a couple of non-legislative things that we're also sort of keeping our eyes on. I think folks might know that for several years, we've had an ongoing campaign to stop the use of aversive skin shocks at the Judge Rottenberg Center in Canton, Massachusetts. We finally were able to get a little bit of headway on that, where the FDA was willing to finally sign the regulations that would have outlawed that practice, the use of that at that one location. and but now court battles, court entanglements have placed a stay on those FDA regulations. Additionally, Health and Human Services, our good friend Seema Verma, has delayed the implementation of the final settings rule. Again, this plays right into that stuff that John was talking about with respect to sub-minimum wages and the settings where those types of wages are paid. And so that's been delayed for another couple of years. That would be a rule from CMS that would make sure that community means community. Community means individuals exercising as much control as possible over the terms and conditions and circumstances of where and how they live. And then finally, just in closing, probably we want to encourage folks to look at their states very closely. Maryland, we know, has time and again has taken headfirst on the issue of physician-assisted suicide. I would contend that its companion in the current environment are the development of crisis standard of care, and those documents and what those documents mean in terms of the valuing of lives of people with disabilities. No matter what I was trying to do was sort of hit on a variety of the types of topics that people might be interested in. No matter what your interest is, and there's plenty of things to advocate on. The most important thing is what we're hearing from congressional staffers is that their lines are not ringing. They need to hear from us. They absolutely need to hear what our people need, and that we expect that they're going to stand up and they're going to protect us and they're going to help us and they're going to take care of us the same way they take care of their friends who are running nursing homes and institutions. Free our people.
Thank you very much, Amy. Very well said. Excellent presentation. I'm so glad we were able to have you here today. Lindsay Barron from the National Council on Independent Living is here today. And I will say about Lindsay Barron that I get about 60 to 100 emails a day. But the one I read is always from Lindsay, because when she sends something, it's important. So thank you very much today for being here, Lindsay, and I will turn it over to you for your remarks today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. So hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay. I work at the National Council on Independent Living, or NCIL. I'm the policy analyst. I'm really appreciative that I got to go last, because the other three speakers were incredible and covered so much stuff in so much detail that I can kind of breeze through some of the other topics that I was planning to go into a little more depth into. So that's really helpful. I think that the first thing I want to just start out by saying is, NCIL has a ton of legislative priorities. Many of the issues that other speakers have mentioned are really important to NCIL as well. And at the end of this, I'm going to give you some information so you can get more details on all of NCIL's priority issues. I'll put a link in the chat and I'll read off the link as well. But I do today mostly want to focus on a couple key things right now, because there really are only a few key things Congress is focused on right now. And so, even though we have a lot of priority issues and those remain on our radar and we continue to work on those key things are where a majority of our efforts are going. Right now, Congress is really focused on COVID. They're really focused on avoiding a shutdown, so funding, and they're focused on the election, which for us means, like some of the other speakers have said, we're focused on voting. There are other bills in play, but what we are hearing and what we're feeling is that it's quite unlikely that anything else will move in this Congress. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because it's so important that we try to get as many of our priorities into a COVID package. And it's so important that they reach a compromise and actually pass something. This is really right now our main shot. And so a big focus of ours is getting them to address the disability community's needs and priorities in some type of COVID package, and then turning this into an environment where it's is just unacceptable and unfathomable that they could leave for recess without passing some type of package. And like Amy said, what we're hearing, whether this is true or not, is that they're just not hearing from us. They're not hearing about our needs. They're not hearing our demands. And so I think that that's really important. If you take one kind of key thing away, is that if you've called once, if you've called 10 times, double, triple, quadruple that. Call every day, email every day. I think we just need to really ramp up the pressure and really keep that consistent messaging, that it is unacceptable for them to have not addressed our needs to this point and for them not to reach a compromise before they leave. Because we need relief from COVID, and we need the specific priorities that we've been pushing, and I'm going to go into that as well. So just as a reminder, kind of as where things are, Congress has passed 4 packages so far. The last one was considered kind of an interim package, so they called it 3.5, so they keep referring to this as COVID 4. That was passed at the end of April, and there's been nothing passed into law since then, so we're in September now. In May, the House passed the HEROES Act. That certainly doesn't include all of the disability community's priorities, but it did include quite a few of the things we've been pushing for. I know Steve talked some about this. It included dedicated funding for home and community-based services, or HCBS. It includes a general FMAP bump. It included housing funding, some education funding. It included some really important stuff, even if it didn't include everything we needed. In July, the Senate introduced the HEALS Act. And then since the HEALS Act, they introduced, or they created a skinny bill, which was kind of a pared down version of that. And then they introduced an even skinnier bill, which was the bill that they put through a procedural vote last week that failed. That skinnier bill had very few meaningful or helpful things in it. It included, again, which already has been talked about, an incredibly harmful immunity provision, which would basically protect businesses and schools and medical providers and nursing facilities and other long-term care facilities from liability for harm they cause in almost any situation during COVID. So not just related to COVID, but anything that kind of comes up during COVID. So it's truly egregious. Now, you know, the House and Senate seem miles away at this point. There was a point where it seemed like they might reach some type of compromise. And it seems like they're getting a little bit farther and farther away. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. That said, again, this is a huge priority. And Amy, I think, illustrated really well the ways that COVID is devastating our community. So I think we have no choice but to just keep ramping up the pressure. And again, just to make it so that it's unacceptable for them not to address our needs. And, you know, I think it's helpful for us to be really focused on what the things that we want them to include are. Steve talked a lot about some of the things that they're pushing for, and we really, as a community, I think, have been working together on a lot of these things. I think that's one thing that's been really helpful, is that we've come together to determine a lot of the priorities and have consistent messaging. I'm just going to reiterate a couple of the things that we've been pushing really hard for. One of those key things has been targeted funding for home and community-based services. So obviously this is critical for keeping people at home, preventing folks from being forced into congregate settings during the pandemic. The way it's structured in the HEROES Act allows for a lot of flexibility in terms of what can be considered or what can be used with this funding. So it includes things like hazard pay and PPE for direct care workers and getting people off the waiting list, workforce recruitment. There's a ton of ways that this funding can be spent. And so ideally, we'd like the HCBS provision to be structured in that way so that there's flexibility as well. We absolutely want increased Medicaid funding generally, but specific targeted HCBS funding is really a necessity right now. I think Amy mentioned this as well, access to PPE for direct care workers. This protects workers, this protects our community as well. This is vital. This is, these are essential personnel and they need to be treated this way nationwide. I know that state by state there's different protections in place, but this needs to be put in place across the country. Housing funding and protections for all people, including specific funding for housing for disabled people, and including a broad, comprehensive eviction and foreclosure moratorium for the duration of the pandemic. So I know you've probably seen information about some of the executive actions and orders that Trump has put forward, and that's just completely insufficient. We really need Congress to take action, to do things comprehensively, and to take action for the duration of the pandemic rather than just delaying things, which can end up ultimately being more harmful. I know also Amy mentioned Dharma and READY, which are two bills that would address kind of putting in place an infrastructure to address disaster preparedness and disaster relief for disabled folks. This is, something that needed to be put in place a long time ago. But right now, when we're facing COVID on top of other disasters, we're seeing, hurricanes and wildfires. This is just absolutely critical. And so we're pushing for that to be put into the COVID relief packages. And then we're also pushing for that to be, done as separate packages as well. So that's just something to keep on your radar as well. And then I think everybody mentioned this, but I know John specifically talked a lot about the voting pieces as well. That's a huge priority. So, NICL's been working really closely with other organizations, including all three of the speakers' organizations. We're very concerned about both this election and beyond accessible voting. So we want to fight barriers and challenges to voting and increase access to the ballot for all disabled people, which means expanding accessible options to everyone so that everyone truly has the right to a private and independent vote, whether they're voting at home or at a polling location during the pandemic and then beyond the pandemic as well. And so NICL has brought together a coalition to work on accessible voting, and this is something that we hope will continue for quite some time as well. I don't want to go on too much, but I do want to, one thing that I do want to mention also is funding for the USPS. That's a big issue that we weren't pushing at the very beginning of this, but it's come to light as a really critical issue right now. So we also are pushing in the COVID relief package for funding for the Postal Service to make up for the significant shortfalls that they're facing, which can be, detrimental not only in the upcoming election, but also to people who rely on the Postal Service for medication deliveries and benefits checks and a whole lot of other things. I do want to note that in addition to the COVID relief bills that we've seen so far, all containing some level of funding for the USPS, there is a separate bill that passed the House. It's HR 8015, and that would provide $25 billion in funding to the USPS, and it would block the operational changes that have been slowing down the mail and threatening the delivery of ballots for the election and everything. So, and I want to note that, this issue was taken up really solely because of the public outcry. So, that is really what our action and our cumulative kind of advocacy can do. In a really short period of time, people were sending their stories and contacting Congress, and the House took really expedient action and held a hearing and passed a bill, and the Senate held a hearing too. And so I just want to kind of flag that as a reason for us to kind of keep up our action, but also this as a particular issue to make sure to focus on too. There are other priorities, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I want to just flag, NICL sent out an alert recently, and if you go to advocacymonitor.com, and I can plug that into the chat later, but it's just the word advocacy and then the word monitor.com. That should be the top alert on that page. And in addition to the call to action, there are links to 2 different letters with lists of the full kind of priorities that disability organizations have come together and put together for the COVID relief packages. So you could see more at those letters. I think that most of the other priorities outside of the COVID relief packages have been talked about by the other speakers, and I know we want to leave some time for Q&A, but I do just want to mention that, you know, one of the consistent priorities outside of this is ending the institutional bias. And Amy did a really fantastic job of explaining the institutional bias and why this is such a critical focus. But I just want to, you know, kind of talk about on top of the HCBS funding, we absolutely support that we need Money Follows the Person to be permanently reauthorized. It, again, has gone through a series of short-term extensions that have really ultimately harmed the program, and so many states have been unable to continue their programs. And so permanent reauthorization with funding is a top priority. On top of that, really, you know, other bills that support getting people out of institutional settings and supporting people in the community. The HCBS Infrastructure Improvement Act is another bill that was introduced in the Senate, but not the House this year. That's kind of building on the balancing incentive program. So I just wanted to flag that since that hadn't been mentioned. And then there's other bills that are kind of in the works and haven't been introduced. So I think we'll see more action on this type of stuff in the next Congress, but I think that that's going to be really important at the beginning of the next Congress to kind of hit the ground running while we're still working on trying to get stuff into the COVID relief package as well, because this is an area that I know all of our organizations are constantly working on. So I think I'm over my 10 minutes, so I will hand the mic back to you, Mike. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And so people should go to advocacymonitor.com. Can they sign up there so they make sure they get all of your alerts?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I mentioned that I would also, I'm going to add to the chat another link so that people can see our full advocacy priorities guide, and that has other stuff outside of COVID as well. Sure. So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Good. And the other organizations, please make sure that you put in the chat box how people can get on your mailing list so that they can be alerted to take action. It's sad to hear that Congress just really isn't hearing from us. I know a lot of people are just caught up in trying to fight through their own lives. So it's a difficult time, but there's always time to make a phone call. There's always time to send an email. So thank you very much, Lindsay. And thank the rest of you for presenting today. We've got a few minutes, so let's take some questions. And if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself, and we'll take your questions now.
Mike, it's Katie from ARI. I put my question in the chat box, but I think it's gotten lost up there. So Mike, we've been doing a lot of work on technology access, not just for people in nursing facilities, but also people in the community. I was wondering if this is something that's happening on a nationwide level. In Maryland, the law says that people in facilities need to have reasonable access to private use of a telephone, but that's all it says. And when people are quarantined in their rooms, it's very difficult to get in contact with them. But we're also seeing problems in the community of people. Now this is our world, we're all virtual, but people don't have access to Wi-Fi, they don't have access to technology, whether it be they can't afford it, they don't know how to use it. So I'm wondering if there's anything happening on the federal level that's kind of addressing these issues.
Yeah, access to technology specifically from nursing homes. Let's try and break this up in two pieces. Let's talk about access. Has there anything in any of these bills that you folks know of that deals with people's rights to have access to communications while they're in facilities? Anybody? Okay, we're going to be producing a letter soon from Maryland to the from the Centers for Independent Living and other advocacy groups in Maryland to the Lieutenant Governor to try and modernize a regulation that was created in 2004. It didn't really say anything about access to wireless technologies or communication capabilities. So hopefully we'll be able to move on that, and maybe our letter will help this become a national priority, because I'm sure it's a problem in lots of facilities. Some facilities say, yeah, we have access to Wi-Fi, but then, there's certain areas of the facility where it doesn't work very well. So, too bad for you. So it is an issue we really do have to work on. Other questions?
Well, this is Amy.
Hi, Amy.
Yeah, on that issue. Because I can tell you that, like in Kansas, we really are taking that on as sort of a concerted state
Mhm.
state effort. I think that once you remove the discrete urban centers of Maryland from the map, you have a landscape that doesn't, quite frankly, look a lot unlike Kansas in terms of rural. The rural nature of it. And so we've actually been working with our state folks to talk about doing sort of cooperatives to get internet access to more rural parts of the state. And then with respect to the question of connectivity in facilities, I mean, the thing I keep telling folks is, I don't know about any of the rest of y'all, but I haven't been in a hotel for about 7 years where I didn't have Wi-Fi in my hotel room. And so if I can get Wi-Fi on the 12th floor of a Hilton, you damn sure think you could get Wi-Fi in every room of a nursing facility if they were motivated to do it.
Yep.
One of the issues that we're having here that we've had for a long time is this question of sort of the nanny cams and setting up sort of people's right to set up video surveillance in their rooms
Yeah.
facilities. And we're actually we're working with our Advocates for Better Care to marry those connectivity issues together in the
That's an
facility.
excellent idea. Thank you. That's a really good point. Thank you very much.
This is Lindsay. If I could.
Yeah, Lindsay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to let folks know too, there has been a small coalition that has been pushing for an emergency broadband benefit to be added to whatever final package comes from Congress. And so that's not specific to long-term care facilities and nursing facilities at all, but that has been a push. It hasn't seemed to be gaining momentum. I know that there was a letter and it had quite a significant number of sign-ons, but it doesn't seem, I haven't seen it in any of the packages that have been introduced. But I think that that's at least on the radar from the advocacy side. So I just kind of wanted to flag that.
Thank you. Yep. No, that's good. Other questions for our panelists before we lose all of them?
I have a question.
Who's that?
Laurie.
Hi, Laurie.
I know this is an age-old issue, but as far as paying people with disabilities less than minimum wage, what is the rationale for this? I mean, do they think, well, you're getting other medical benefits, so we don't need to pay? I mean, what is the rationale? I don't understand.
I can.
That's a very long, complicated answer,
Yeah.
but essentially well, I'll let anybody from the panel speak to it. Anybody have a short answer for that one?
How about the
Sure.
gentleman for the Federation for the Blind?
I believe John had to leave. I think I heard him exit, but maybe not.
This is Steve. It's rooted in an 82-year-old law, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Essentially, back in the 30s, this was what they considered progressive legislation. Was that they were going to at that time they weren't paying people with disabilities anything, and so they thought, well, let's pay them a sub minimum wage. But that was back in the 30s, and obviously, we've progressed as a society to the point where we no longer believe that people with disabilities are any less valuable to society than anyone else, and so that's why we're trying to eliminate that. But it's rooted in a very old law that needs to be changed.
I see. Okay.
And rooted in the belief that people with disabilities couldn't produce a level that people without disabilities could produce, so we can pay them less. This in part.
We have passed legislation to stop that in Maryland.
Yes.
Oh,
Right.
good.
Mike, I have a question that came in on email.
Sure. Go ahead.
So someone asked that we have more access and influence on the state legislative level compared to Congress. How can we translate issues such as the LTSS and disaster preparedness into state level bills? And what can be done during the 2021 legislative session so we don't have to wait until the Senate flips? So it's two questions.
Wow. Anybody want to take a whack at that? I think right at this moment, the question, at least in my mind, has been what kind of session will we have? And to what extent will it be a full session? There's discussion right now about limiting the number of bills that might be passed in a session, limiting the extent to which people can go physically, and to what extent can they vote remotely. I wish Delegate Guyton was still here. She was on earlier. Are you still here, Michelle? I didn't think so. She had to go to another meeting, I think. But I think the real question is going to be what can we do, and then how can we, where do we really put the kind of pressure that we need to put in order to make these things happen? So it's kind of a work in progress at this point, and others can certainly add to what I just said.
Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is Amy. I mean, through the years, we've been able to adapt, has been able to use like the National Governors Association and the roles of our governors in those types of organizations, our state Medicaid directors, to get them to lead, with respect to, federal priorities and federal advocacy. I mean, and so, it feels, like we're all kind of, and it is true. I mean, we do have a lot more politics being local. We have a lot of influence locally, but the reality is that a lot of our local elected representatives and civil servants, they all connect into a national network. And that national network can have quite a bit of influence at the federal level. So Linz?
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it goes both ways. I think that, the state legislators and state politicians absolutely have influence on the federal legislators. And so if you can get, the state politicians to try to influence the federal folks, the national level folks, I think that that's huge, and that can absolutely turn the tide on certain issues. But then also, we've seen instances where states have taken, a federal bill that isn't necessarily moving and have implemented similar legislation at the state level, and had success with that as well at the state level. And so I think that there is a possibility, like certain legislation, it's harder to do. Like, DARMA is about Medicaid portability, and that might be more difficult to do. But something like the READY Act, which is about setting up regional TA centers to, get folks on the ground to understand better how to work with disabled folks during disasters, that is something that local folks can start doing right now in your state, And so I think that there are certain bills, certain federal bills that you could absolutely model state level bills off of, and put them into action. So I think it kind of goes both ways, where you could kind of use the state folks to pressure action at the national level, and then kind of vice versa, take the national models and implement them at the state level.
And if I
Excellent.
could for just a second. So prior to my current role with United Spinal, I spent 10 years on Capitol Hill as a congressional staffer. So I do have experience in, sort of the other side of this. And I will say most definitely, federal legislators look to what's happening in their states because they want to use success stories from their state as a model for the rest of the country. I worked in Senator Menendez's office in New Jersey for 10 years. And one specific program I can think of that was used as a model was the maternal and infant home visiting program, which started in New Jersey and then was used as a model for the country and was rolled into the Affordable Care Act. I can just, for the example of ending subminimum wage, the experience of Maryland will be vital in showing the success of ending subminimum wage. What comes out of Maryland will definitely be used by the supporters of the Transformation and Competitive Employment Act as just showing just how successful this policy is for people with disabilities and, for society generally. And so, view states as basically like the laboratories of America. In certain states, certain policies have gone well and certain policies have not gone well. And so, people in Congress, look to the states and see what's gone well, and they look to replicate that. And what hasn't gone well, they typically don't look to replicate that federally.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. Yeah, very well said. We've run out of time. I want to thank everybody for being here today. And excuse me. We've run out of time. We do have a few moments. If any of you have community announcements of events or activities that you want the world to know about.
So I have one real quick.
Sure.
It is Direct Support Professionals Awareness Week. And DDA is looking for stories anybody has about how awesome your DSP is so that we can put them on the DDA Facebook page. So I will put my email address in the chat, and then people can just send that my way, and we will put them up shortly.
All right. Carol Gottlieb, thank you very much. Any other community announcements of activities coming up?
People, this is Crystal from the Image Center. If folk would like to continue the conversation about nursing facilities and needs of residents in nursing facilities and people transitioning, we can continue portions of that conversation on the third Friday of each month. We're having a meeting from 2 to 3 o'clock by Zoom, and we'll continue to send out notices about that. That's called our Second Beginnings meeting, and it's all geared towards people transitioning to the community and nursing facility residents.
If people want to get on a list to be informed about those meetings, do they send an email to you or to the Image Center? What's the method?
Yep, they can either email me at cbrockington@imagemd.org, or they can email Image Center directly, and the email will come to me and we will follow up.
Yep. Info@imagemd.org if you want to get on any of our lists. Just as a reminder, we do produce every year somewhere around 40 different individualized devices for folks with disabilities that aren't available in the marketplace. If you have a need for that or know of people who do, please get them to us so that we can work with them. And don't forget about next week's program, by the way, Work Without Fear, using work incentives to protect benefits when you work. Powerful subject. It'll be next week at 2 o'clock. Michael Dalto, a national expert on benefits planning and development, will be here to help you weave your way through. Any other final announcements before we go? I want to thank everyone for being here today. As you know, this will be on YouTube, so please, if you feel like you want to see this in a couple of days, it usually takes us a day or two to get it edited and up there. But thanks to everyone. Thanks very much to the panel. You guys have been phenomenal. You did exactly what we hoped you would do. Really a great educational opportunity for us here in Maryland. So thank you all. Until next week, I am powerful and you are powerful as well. And thank you for attending the I Am broadcast. Take care, folks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.